Hello, everybody. Welcome back to episode 2 of the Resilient Responder podcast. I'm your host, Rothrock. A big thanks to Firefighter Nation for giving me the opportunity to have the show and to share these stories and thoughts with you. I want to say a big thank you to the response to the first episode of this show. It came together really quickly. A massive amounts of gratitude to Aubrey Underwood for being our first guest, the dispatcher that we had last time. And just thanks for listening and for giving such great feedback. I was honestly really surprised. So thanks. And here we go again for episode number 2. So just to recap, the Resilient Responder podcast is a podcast not just for first responders, but also for trauma survivors, anyone who has to make decisions in sort of high pressure environments, and really just anyone who's interested in their own ability to be resilient, which is hopefully all of us. We're going to be doing a book giveaway. Exciting. So if you're watching me right now, you'll see I'm holding up a copy of my book, After Trauma. I am going to sign this to you, to whoever else you want me to sign it to. I'll send it anywhere in the world, completely free. All you have to do is go on Instagram and like Resilient Responder Podcast and Allie W. Rothrock on Instagram. So you got to follow both Resilient Responder Podcast and Allie W. Rothrock on Instagram. You will be entered to win the signed copy of After Trauma. I'll send it anywhere, and you have until the end of day on November 26th. So end of day, November 26th, to be entered to win that giveaway. So I want to start today. You're just going to have me, no guest. I want to start today with some words that I wrote in my book, After Trauma, that sort of lead us into what we're going to be talking about today, which is the power and the purpose of staying connected with ourselves and with our communities, and what that has to do with our mental health, what that has to do with our ability to be resilient, and what research even could show us about our degrees of connection versus isolation, and how that can have an impact on our mental health if we do experience something difficult, like say a bad call or some other type of life adversity. So here's what I wrote. Since stepping into the counseling community myself, I've noticed a tendency to over-pathologize trauma. There is an inclination to draw linear lines between an experience and its anticipated trigger, to expect that people who have felt trauma will hold it or identify with it in the same way, to forget that there is a person in addition to their symptoms. The way shame blocks one's ability to comfort the younger versions of ourselves that were hurt is discounted and dismissed. I've seen non-trauma informed therapists take an approach that is too intellectual. They list positive coping skills, offer the definition of resilience, and send people on their way. But trauma is felt. It is lived in all our relationships, especially the relationship we have with ourselves. Trauma is stored in little pockets of our brains, written into our cells, carried in our blood. We can only shed it the same way we got it, through experience. We must look at overcoming trauma through a holistic lens, by supporting people through new positive experiences that help rewrite the parts of their brains that learned fear, through movement to release the stored stress our bodies hold, through acknowledging losses, and by supporting the meaning-making process. And I really want to highlight that sentence in the middle there, that it is lived in all our relationships, especially the relationship we have with ourselves. It being trauma, it being a difficult life experience, some sort of adversity that we want to consider as having an impact on us. So if our internal relationship, the relationship we have with ourselves, starts to feel chaotic, or it starts to feel like maybe we can't trust ourselves, we can't trust our reactions, we start to not trust our instincts because maybe we think they let us down at one point. If that internal relationship starts to feel strained, we might feel a tendency to isolate ourselves from our external relationships, from our communities. And that could look like hanging out with friends less, talking with people at work less, or just isolating ourselves. Not being open about how we're feeling if something is bothering us. And we all have things that bother us from time to time, right? But I'm talking about something that's really stuck in there. Something that is on our minds more than it's not on our minds. Maybe it's a really bad call that we ran, or something hard that happened in the course of doing our job, something we saw, something we witnessed or experienced. And it just starts to become really, really present. And we might feel like, well, I might be the only one that's feeling that. And so I certainly don't want to open myself up to any judgment about that. Maybe we feel like I don't want to be that vulnerable. We don't want to be judged. I mean, that's really true for how I was when I was in sort of the depths of my trauma was I just wanted to be okay. So desperately just wanted to be okay. And I thought if I just pretend that I am for long enough, I'll wake up one day and be okay. And that's just simply not how trauma recovery works. If you could, I wrote about this in After Trauma too. I said, like, if you could outwill trauma, I would have done it. Because that was my, like, if that was possible, I would have done it because that was my approach versus finding connection, versus finding people that I could share with or talk to. My approach was just to white knuckle my way through it and hope that one day I woke up and the burden was lighter. And that's just not how it works. But I understand that instinct to isolate because it feels easier than trying to find that connection or find someone who we can be vulnerable with. But the connection is what I needed in order to start to be able to live the rest of my life. And the first sort of place, I mean, I had friends, I had family, I had things like that at the time, but the first piece of connection that I needed on my trauma recovery journey was someone who could help me understand what was going on with me internally, what was going on with my internal experience and sort of the valley of trauma and traumatic symptoms that I was experiencing, the PTSD of it all. And the first place that I found that was with my trauma therapist, Jill, who I wrote about in After Trauma, who will always have such a big space in my heart because she gave me a point of connection that was safe, non-judgmental, a place where I could be as vulnerable as I could possibly be. And that is what I needed. But we do have that tendency to isolate. And so that connection is important for us always, even just when life in general, like, and I'm gesturing sort of generally to national things, global things locally in our town, all the way down to things that are impacting us. Finding ways to stay connected turns out to be pretty critical for our resilience and our ability to move forward when something difficult happens. But so often our instinct is sort of to do the opposite. So I want to talk about what I found while researching for my thesis around this ability to stay connected versus isolating. I don't know if you've ever written a graduate level thesis. It takes forever and has to be so many pages and have so many sources. And I really just set out. So the title of my thesis is Exploring the Mental Health Impacts of Incidents of Mass Violence on First Responders. And I certainly found that by researching incidents that took place globally and throughout history. And what I also found was just sort of general data about things that we can help ourselves with in the now to allow ourselves to be more resilient if a big incident happens, but also just in our day to day. Because, of course, we don't want to be waiting for something really bad to happen. We don't want to wait until that, really big call comes or that big, moment of life adversity happens in our personal lives to then figure out, okay, how can I help myself here? Because we're not going to be thinking our most clearly, right? So we want to be putting those things into practice now. And so I want to talk about an incident that I found a really fascinating study on. And don't worry, I'm not going to bore you with numbers and statistics and details, but this is one of the most interesting things that I found that I teach on and bring up the most because it provides insight into action that we can take today to help ourselves be more resilient for tomorrow. So let's talk about an incident that happened not that terribly long ago, so you'll probably remember what I'm talking about. So we're going to Paris. We're going to Paris, France. It was around 9 p.m. on the night of Friday, November 13th, 2005. In Paris, and a series of coordinated terrorist attacks at 3 different sites around the city took place almost simultaneously that would eventually kill 130 people. So suicide bombers struck outside of a soccer stadium. Other terrorists just just indiscriminately opened fire on restaurant patrons, both that were inside and outside of this cafe. And then a third group took hundreds of people hostage in the Bataclan music venue, this indoor theater. So throughout the 3 different terrorist sites, 45 different medical teams, untold numbers of firefighters, countless police officers. I mean, you can imagine something like that erupting in your city at 3 different locations, the amount of first responders that are going to be called. So hundreds and hundreds of responders showed up, dividing between the different sites and where people were that needed help. Quickly, medical examiners arrived to begin cataloging the bodies, and detectives gathered crime scene evidence. The hostage situation at the Bataclan took a very long time to resolve. A large number of people were killed in that area, and so that incident obviously was more active for longer. Images of knocked over bloodied tables and chairs, fleeing patrons, and scrambling first responders began to play on the news. And so about 8 to 12 months after these attacks happened, so in 2006, any first responder who had responded during the night and or in the immediate aftermath of the terror attacks had the possibility, it was an option, totally voluntary, of answering a web-based study about any of the impacts felt. And in the end, over 660 first responders decided to participate. So I really liked this study as it did control for things like previous life trauma, previous mental health struggles, anything like that people wanted to name. Participants were asked if they had any previous psychological interventions that were helpful. I thought it was interesting that they were asked if they received any previous training for such an event, as in not how do we respond to a terrorist attack operationally, but how do we respond to it emotionally, mentally, and for ourselves. And I also thought it was interesting that they were asked if they had been warned about any potential psychological side effects of responding to such an event. I'd never seen data be gathered on that before, or that question being asked. So just as a point of interest, 59% of firefighters, 60% of police officers, and 30% of EMS workers said they had been warned of potential psychological impacts. And I thought that was curious. Overall, this study was one of the most interesting I found as it relates to mental health impacts based on specific on-scene exposures. And again, what that can tell us about things we can integrate into our lives now to help us with any sort of life adversity that comes. So this study asked questions like, yes or no, did you see a dead body? Did you touch a dead body? Did you hear gunshots? Did you provide psychological support to victims? Did you feel distressed by seeing victims? Had you phoned victims or relatives of victims? And did you provide any other psychological support to your peers? So the results were really, really interesting. But what I really want to touch on is this one sentence. And this is the one that I have been writing about and bringing up a lot because it's so relevant to us. So just a point, first of all, is that in this study, and in all other studies, by the way, but in this study particularly, gender was not affiliated with higher rates of PTSD. So as someone who got a PTSD diagnosis in 2012, who has spoken very publicly for very many number of years about post-traumatic stress disorder, who has been told, oh, only women get PTSD, just in case that's you who has that thought, the data shows that's not true. And specifically in this case, gender was not affiliated with higher rates of PTSD. But, and here's the thing I really want you to listen to, having a higher degree of social isolation was affiliated with higher rates of PTSD. Having a higher degree of social isolation was affiliated with those higher rates. And like I mentioned last time, Dr. Faith Harper and her book, Unfuck Your Brain, I talked about it last time. I'm holding it up right now. If you're watching the video, it's this little yellow book that is the best book I have ever read on practical trauma recovery. She talks about PTSD as a failure to recover from a traumatic event. So PTSD definitions forever. The DSM has so many, such a long definition about all the different factors of PTSD. We can have a conversation talking about potentially changing the name to PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury. I think that that could make a lot of sense. But the point is having communities that we can be connected with, having people that we can be vulnerable with, and knowing ourselves well enough to be able to name how we're feeling provide so many protective factors that will allow us to recover from a traumatic event versus a failure to recover from a traumatic event. And I want to also mention every time I give that definition, a failure to recover, I'm not saying you failed. I'm not saying you as a person failed or did anything wrong. All that means is the mechanism in your life did not exist for you to make adequate meaning out of the experience that you had and get the support that you needed, especially in that first critical 30-day window after something traumatic happened, to be able to recover. So you didn't fail. It just means that you didn't have capacity for whatever reason to make meaning out of that experience. You know, when I was 16 and all of those really hard things happened to me that led to my PTSD, I did not have capacity. I did not have a meaning-making paradigm. I did not have support. I did not have the words. And that definitely contributed to my lack of ability to recover from what happened to me. And so this speaks to the power of staying connected. And this is something that we can work on sustaining each and every day. So I mentioned in the last episode, my husband's in the Air Force. We're in a season of moving a lot. And one of the things that I didn't necessarily anticipate about that is that not only are we moving a lot, our friends are moving a lot, always away from us. And so we'll get somewhere. We've been in Texas, meet some great people, and they leave 3 months later. And it's really hard to maintain relationships when you're always leaving. And of course, social media exists and phones exist and all of that, but it's not the same as being able to be connected with people, you know, face to face. And so that's something that I've absolutely had to contend with and try to find ways around. And it's sort of exhausting to always be meeting new people and trying to establish new friendships and trying to establish new relationships, but it's always so worth it. It's always so worth it. And so that power of staying connected is something that we can try to work on each and every day. And so, you know, maybe as you're driving home from work later today, or you have, you know, you're taking a walk this weekend or whatever, a friend pops into your head, someone you haven't touched base with in a while, shoot them a text, call them, see how they're doing. You're establishing that connection for them as much as for you. And so if a day is challenging for whatever reason, you both have that connection established. And you know that that's a person that you can call. And I often encourage people, like I do a class on coping skills. What is that? What does that mean? Again, it's one of those sort of like therapy phrases that people are like, yeah, coping skills, sure. But what does that mean? What does that look like? And one of our healthiest ways that we can cope with stress is simply by doing it in the company of other people. And I've spoken about this a lot, and I think phrase it this way in After Trauma too, of I think sometimes what we really need in help, like what is most helpful for us when we are trying to work our way through something difficult, is just simply to let someone else be in that situation with us, is to not be alone. And sometimes I really think that's like half of the overcoming of something hard, is just allowing other people to be in that space with us. And there's so many anecdotes that I remember reading. I remember specifically a police officer who had responded to the Sandy Hook shooting talking about sort of this concept of bringing things out into the light and getting things out of the darkness, and how saying things out loud, even if it's a really hard something, that makes it a little less scary and a little easier to contend with if you're not doing it by yourself. And so I want to read a little passage from Dr. Faith Harper's book about making meaning and about creating that for ourselves. This is a quote that I love from her. So she said, "The healthiest people are the ones who find meaning in chaos, the ones who can find the pony in a pile of shit every time." It doesn't make the awful things that happened any less awful. But if we can learn skills of resilience and strength through the terrible things that happen, they can make us better, stronger, more compassionate, and more engaged human beings. More engaged. There's that power of staying connected. Again, we don't have a choice over the things that happen to us, right? We don't have a say in like what calls come in while we're working or choices that people make in our lives that harm us. But what we can do is work to find ways to stay connected. So for me, I mentioned that either we're moving or our friends are always moving. I know like the next place that we're moving to, I've already looked up a running group and a cycling group because those are things that I do in San Antonio now. And I've already looked up those same things in the next place that we're moving, because it just gives me a sense of comfort that even if I can't find friends right away, I can at least find people who, we like the same activity. And so that's a starting place, that we can sort of maybe build a friendship from. And I know it's hard. I know we have things on our mind. We're busy with what we have to do tomorrow, burdens that have been placed on us, all these things, but there's always time for a conversation with a friend, to connect with somebody at work. Maybe you don't know them very well, but you work the same shift, or they're new to your shift, or you were, you hung out a lot when you first started and you haven't hung out in a while. Like, revisit those friendships. And when we're talking about coping skills, and in the course that I teach, I have people, like, obviously just in your mind, make a list of like 5 people that if something hard happened today and you're like, I just really feel like this is going to be a tough one for me for whatever reason, I want to talk to somebody about it. Who would you call? Like, honestly, think about it. Who would you call if you needed to? And I know people say to me, well, I don't want to be a burden to people, all these things. I guarantee you, the people in your life that love you and care about you want you to be a burden. Like, you're not, but they want you to call. They want you to call and have those conversations, because that isolation can become a habit, and it can become a habit that's really hard to break. And our minds can become dark places when we're alone too long. And so even if it's one person that you want to add to your mental list of, this is somebody that I could call if I was having a hard time, maybe it's someone at work, a cousin, someone you went through the fire academy with, like whoever, there's got to be one, at least one. And then think about people in your life that you could be that person for. Like, oh, if they were going through something hard, I hope they know that they could call me. And shoot them a text, just say hi and see how they're doing. Because as the data shows, as we anecdotally know, staying connected, even in small ways, is a major protective factor against long-term mental health struggles or things that are hard getting worse because we make ourselves be alone with them. So I want to remind you again, doing a signed book giveaway. Just a copy of After Trauma right here. Lovely little hardcover book. I'll sign it to you or anyone else you want. I'll send it anywhere in the world. On Instagram, you've got to like Resilient Responder Podcast and Allie W. Rothrock. You have until the end of day on November 26th. November 26th. Leaving you with a couple of resources on thejobanoff.com. The company that I founded, I've been running for 6 years now. We do online mental health education. There's a whole suite of courses that are available 24/7 for a variety of different mental health things: sleep, vicarious trauma, grief, suicide prevention, critical incident stress, having a bad call, all these things. They're available for you right now if that's something that would be helpful. The 3 books I will always encourage you to read is Unfuck Your Brain by Dr. Faith Harper, After Trauma by me, Allie W. Rothrock, and The Obstacle is the Way by Ryan Holiday. I'm going to talk a lot more about that book next time. And I want to leave you with the same thought that I did last time, because the response to that showed me that it was a very helpful sort of prompt for people. So here's the thought. If you knew that in 30 days from now, you were going to run a really bad call or some sort of life adversity was going to pop up, what would you start doing and what would you stop doing to better prepare yourself to meet that stressor? So today, right now, what could you start doing and what would you stop doing to better prepare yourself to meet whatever stress is going to come? Because that stress is going to come, right? It's going to come. All we have a say in is how we respond to it. Thanks for listening. See you next time.